Worried about mass migration, their identity and their independence, and divided about what's best for the economy, the British are putting their membership of a crisis-ridden European Union to the test in a referendum. But surely we've been here before.
Common market!
Having voted to stay in the European club in 1975,
14 years of national argument are over.
the British spent the next 4 decades agonising over their decision.
I will defend the British rebate because it's right and because it's fair.
So-called Eurosceptics say the EU encroaches on British sovereignty
You've got to give up the right to make your own laws.
and feel they've lost control of their borders.
We have a total open door to over 500 million people.
But for the other side, Britain has enjoyed the benefits of the EU's freedom to move and trade. And there's the fear that a breakup will be bad for business and leave Britons poor and isolated.
Britain will be safer, stronger, and better off in a reformed European Union.
My guest tonight is a die-hard Eurosceptic. As British Chancellor or Finance Minister in the early 1990s, he presided over the Black Wednesday financial crash and a painful recession.
Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
He now believes the UK will be better off going it alone. I'm Mehdi Hasan and I've come here to the Oxford Union to go head-to-head with British Conservative politician Norman Lamont, now Lord Lamont. I'll ask him whether the UK will lose power and influence outside the European Union and whether this so-called Brexit will lead to the breakup of the UK and the EU as we know them. Tonight, I'll be joined by Stephen Woolfe, a member of the European Parliament for the UK Independence Party, UKIP. Agnès Poirier, a French journalist and commentator based in London. And HUGO DIXON, author of The In-Out Question, Why Britain Should Stay in the EU and Fight to Make It Better. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Norman Lamont. Norman Lamont served under 2 Prime Ministers, Margaret Thatcher and John Major. Since 1998, he has sat in the House of Lords as Lord Lamont of Lerwick. Lord Lamont, in June, you want the people of the United Kingdom to quit a political and economic club, the European Union, that they've been part of for 43 years, without spelling out exactly what the alternative to that club is, to that arrangement is. Surely you'd accept that at a very minimum, if Brexit, British exit from the European Union, is not a leap into the abyss, then at least it is, in the words of David Cameron, the Prime Minister, your former advisor, a leap into the unknown.
Yes, but whichever side of the argument you're on, there are a whole set of counterfactuals. The EU is developing, and the EU wants to integrate further. The EU wants to enlarge further. The EU wants to have Turkey in, which would be a profound change. The EU wants to shore up the euro, which will affect Britain, the way in which this is done. The degree of political integration. Europe is not static. The idea that this is a choice between the status quo and something that is changing, is not right.
What do you say to a person who, when asked about whether they should vote to stay in the EU, says, to come out of it now with nowhere else to go would jeopardize our children's future? What's the alternative? Or who says, at a time of uncertainty, if we want our children to continue to enjoy the benefits of peace, then we have to stay in Europe. British influence has to be exerted on the continent. What do you say to them?
Well, look, on the question of trade,
wrong?
this argument that is being put, that you have to be in there in order to trade, is a completely overstated, over-exaggerated idea.
So it's overstated and exaggerated to say that it would jeopardize our children's future. What's the alternative? For our children to enjoy peace, we must be part of Europe. What I'm reading out to you are Margaret Thatcher's words.
Peace has not depended upon the EU. In fact, I would argue the EU came quite close in its mishandling of the Ukraine crisis to nearly jeopardizing peace in Europe. But peace has been dependent much more upon NATO. I think the idea that peace in Europe depends upon the EU is a completely false and, to be honest, rather silly argument.
So Margaret Thatcher was being silly when she said that?
Mehdi, I adore the memory of Mrs. Thatcher, and you can recite lots of things about her. Doesn't mean I have to agree with every one of them.
Fine, so you agree that she was being silly when she said that. You're a conservative, a proud free marketeer, a free trader, and yet you're basically saying you don't want to be part of the world's biggest, freest single market, the European Union. That's what you're advocating.
Does the United States not have access to the EU?
Not to the single market, it doesn't.
Mehdi, if you look at the figures on statistics, you will find the United States exports in services almost as much as we do.
In quantity, in money.
Despite being thousands of miles away.
And despite being 6 times our size.
And despite not having any say in the so-called decisions.
All these people who think, all these banks who are worried about it, all these businesses who are worried about it, all these economists who all come out and say the damage to the British economy, all these studies showing the losses to growth that will come out, they're all just imagining it. We should just take your word on trust that we will be fine.
Mehdi, I'm a devoted fan of your reading, and this is the first time I've ever heard you so sincerely espousing the Goldman Sachs argument, the Morgan Stanley argument, the JP Morgan argument. I actually think it ought to be determined by the people of this country, not by those banks. If you take small businesses are much more concerned about the regulation that comes out of the EU. Big business, obviously, is just worried about change.
Actually,
any change is obviously a cost, is an uncertainty.
The Federation of Small Business did a poll of 6,000 small businesses. They found that more wanted to stay in than leave, 47% to 40%. So you're wrong on the small business front, and you're wrong on the big business front.
One poll may have said that, but more entrepreneurial businesses, more small businesses tend to have a different view.
Maybe. But dealing with the specifics of the countries that are outside the EU, the Chinese government say very clearly, we want Britain to remain an important member of the EU. The Japanese say they expect the UK to maintain its favourable role in the EU as a gateway. The Indian government says we want the UK to be our entry point into the EU. The United States top trade envoy says we're not interested in bilateral agreements with the UK. We want the UK to stay in the EU. Should we just ignore all these statements and say, no, all will be fine come June 23rd?
The EU trades with 55 countries on a free trade basis on the world. If you look at Japan exporting to the EU, over 20 years, its exports grew more fast than Britain's exports to the EU. Switzerland is more integrated. The idea that because we withdraw from the EU, trade is going to dry up, jobs are going to be endangered, this is just a allegation that is being put around and has very little justification.
A Swiss government, well, you say that. The Swiss government did a report in 2009 and said we've lost out in jobs and output as a result of our financial sector being cut out of the EU.
Mehdi, all you're doing is repeating people's opinions.
OK, so you tell me what your definition of a fact is.
A fact is a fact.
Let me just talk about, you want facts. OK. The PricewaterhouseCoopers study done earlier this year found that Brexit could cost up to £100 billion and 1 million jobs. A study by the London School of Economics found that Brexit could lead to a fall in national income equivalent to that of the financial crash of 2008. Facts?
Look, lots of people have different opinions. Take Open Europe. Open Europe, which I think does not favour withdrawal from the EU, it said this is a very difficult issue to quantify. The estimates are between, if there was Brexit on a pessimistic assumption, minus 1.5% of GDP, or possibly plus 0.5%. This is
but the most likely scenario, they said, would be a drop of 1% of growth. You know that. Even the study you're quoting says we would do worse off.
The idea that this can be reduced to a whole lot of arithmetical figures is absurd.
That's worrying to hear a former finance minister say he doesn't really respect arithmetical figures.
Well, I think any Chancellor Exchequer who believes economic forecasts needs his head examined.
OK. Let's talk briefly about immigration and the impact on the UK economy. Migrants from the EU tend to be young, better educated than native Brits, more likely to start their own business than native Brits, pay more in taxes than they take out in benefits compared to native Brits. And according to the British government's own figures, they help drive growth and balance the budget. What's not to like about them? Why do people on your side of the argument try and use migrants, EU migrants, as an excuse for Brexit?
Well, obviously, in today's world, Britain needs to have some immigration. Insofar as there is an issue, I think it is simply to do with the sheer scale of immigration into this country. This is not just an EU issue, it is a non-EU issue.
So why, what's Brexit?
Because the EU is half of the issue. And
less than half.
Britain is a very densely populated country. The net immigration into this country is 330,000 people per annum, which, if projected into the future, that means there will be 8 million people added to the population of this country within 15 years. That is not...
So you don't like economic forecasts, but you like migrant forecasts?
That is not sustainable. I like forecasts based on
that are in your
assumptions
favour,
which I have made clear to you.
But the facts, you wanted facts. Migrants help the economy. Do you accept that? The figures show the EU migrants put in more than they take out and help bring down the debt, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility.
I think the argument that immigration is overwhelmingly good for the economy is overstated. The test of whether immigration is good for the economy is the extent to which it improves productivity or GDP.
That's what all the studies show that immigration does.
It is not what all the studies show, Mehdi.
OK. Let's go to our panel, who have been waiting patiently to come in. Hugo Dixon is the author of The In-Out Question, Why Britain Should Stay in the EU and Fight to Make It Better, editor-in-chief of In Facts, a website dedicated to making the case for EU membership. Hugo, what do you say to those people who point out that a lot of the people who are making the case for staying in the EU, who warn that the economy will suffer if Britain were to pull out, were also the same people who said we must join the euro, otherwise the economy will suffer? And they were wrong then. How do we know they're right this time?
It's just not true. Of course, there are some people in the category that you're talking about, and there are equally some people in other categories. For example, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, he didn't advocate us joining the euro. George Osborne, who is now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he didn't advocate joining the euro. But Norman asked for some facts. Well, one fact is that almost half our trade is with the EU. Another fact is that no country which doesn't offer free movement of people has full access to that single market. Of course, we would have some access, but it would be diminished access. And in particular, for the City of London, which is our largest industry, financial services, no country that doesn't have full access to the single market has full access for its finance industry. Now, you said to Norman, can I just say one other thing? That they can't say what out is. Sometimes they say we want to be like Norway. Sometimes they say they want to be like Switzerland. Sometimes they say they want to be like Canada. And there are, frankly, more positions for out than there are positions in the Kama Sutra.
OK. Well, there's an analogy between Brexit that you don't often hear every day. Stephen Woolfe is a member of the European Parliament for the UK Independence Party, UKIP, which campaigns against British membership of the EU. He's the party's spokesman on migration and financial affairs. Stephen, what do you favour? What's your alternative?
I would like to see, as Norman would, a free trade arrangement that works between this country and the European Union, because that is the modern model. The question is, and the other side have to argue, is whether the European Union would put tariffs on. We don't believe they will because of World Trade Organization rules,
the French president has said there will be consequences. The German finance minister says it won't be easy to do a deal with Britain after the Brexit.
Well, of course they would want to say that because they're already positioning themselves to give them the strongest hand, as you would do in any negotiation. We're paying 10% of our GDP in regulatory costs that impact 100% of our businesses when only 10% of our businesses trade with Europe. That's why it would be beneficial to the small businesses in here, because they wouldn't have to deal with those regulations anymore.
OK, let me bring in AGNES, who is a French journalist, author, commentator based here in the UK. Do you think the Britain's continental neighbours, are they going to do the kind of deals that Stephen and Lord Lamont suggest will happen?
Well, I think the parting will be very long, acrimonious, and most unpleasant for everyone. And the conditions of its exit are going to be negotiated without Britain in the room. I remember I covered EU summits, and I asked the question at the Commission and members at the Council. I said, so what about the negotiation afterwards? And they smiled and they say, well, they should ask the Swiss. It was very long, it was very painful, and we made the decisions. I mean, the EU will make Britain, pay for undermining the whole European project.
I am puzzled by this attitude. Why should that be the case? If one country democratically decides it wants to leave the EU, surely that should be respected and accepted. But is an agreement negotiable or not negotiable? Now, this is what Jacques Delors, the president of the Commission, a man dedicated to federalism within the EU, a man I know well, who I had to deal with in government, who I respect, but who has completely different ideas from my own. He said, if the British cannot support the trend towards more integration in Europe, we can nevertheless remain friends. I could imagine a form such as a European Economic Area or a free trade agreement.
So you're having a go at me for quoting people, and yet when I quote the President of France and the Finance Minister of Germany, who say they're going to take consequences, poison Brexit, you come back and quote to me a guy who was European Commission President 21 years ago. Seriously.
But
that's your response. But who has no power, who's not relevant to this debate right now.
Who absolutely embodies the ideals of European integration.
Let's move on to politics. You've been wanting to talk about politics. You've said that for you, quote, the decision about whether we should remain in the EU will not be entirely about economics, it's about politics, it's about democracy. It's a nice line, but what would you say to those who say it's a little bit hypocritical for an unelected peer in Britain's unelected Chamber of Parliament to be lecturing the EU on democracy and elections?
I am not the designer of Britain's constitution or the designer of the situation within which I sit, but I do believe that government should be elected, government should be responsible to voters. You interviewed Viviane Reding in this very hall. She described the European Commission as being the government of the EU. I think one of the problems with the EU is that proposals are put on the basis of intergovernmental agreements, but it's very difficult for a voter or an electorate in one country to undo something that has been agreed by treaty. And you have this whole question of treaty versus national parliament. Now, I actually was just amazed that you could have a situation that you had a Greek electorate rejecting what the EU wanted to impose on Europe, both in an election and in a referendum, and yet the will of Europe had to prevail against national democracy.
What do you say to those who say you've misunderstood the nature of sovereignty? Your former departmental boss, Michael Heseltine, former Deputy Prime Minister, once famously said that a man alone in the desert is sovereign, he's also powerless. Your successor as Conservative Chancellor, Kenneth Clarke, recently argued that if you take the Brexit leave-us-alone argument to, quote, its logical conclusion, the most sovereign nation in the world is North Korea.
No, well, I think they are confusing the concept of sovereignty with the concept of power. Now, you may argue it is better to have power, but the concept of sovereignty and the concept of power are not the same things
Britain still
at all.
has sovereignty.
But sovereignty is also intertwined with the concept of democracy. And I believe that democracy is best represented at a national level. There is no European demos. There is no European public opinion. Yes, we elect a European Parliament, but what does it represent? It crosses 28 countries with different public opinions, different issues. You know, the voters of Denmark do not have a great interest in the same issues as the government of Latvia. The government of the UK has different interests from other governments in the EU.
Let's go back to our panel. Hugo Dixon, surely you would accept Norman Lamont's rather straightforward point that there is no demos in Europe. There is no people. How do you build democracy at an EU level?
I accept that there is no demos. It may develop over a few generations, let's see. But I think you've got to put things in context. Most of the things that are done that matter for the British people are done at a governmental level, are done by our Parliament in Westminster. They are not done at the European level. Norman Lamont said, you've got to distinguish between sovereignty and power. We are extremely influential within the EU. And if we stay in, we will be in a fantastic position to be driving it for the future. But we are not driven by it. There are whole areas that have nothing to do with the EU. It's our army, our NHS, our schools, our planning policies. These are not touched by Brussels.
Lord Lamont, do you want to respond to Hugo?
It's very difficult to estimate precisely what level of laws is determined both directly and indirectly. Some people have put it at 50%, some people have put it at 30%. But,
some at 20.
But, well, or whatever. But let me just make this point. There's one thing I did learn in government, and I have to confess I was a bit shocked by it, and it became clear to me in every meeting I subsequently had with my opposite numbers that, that what I believed was just rhetoric, what I believed was just wind and words, was actually the real ambition. It was to create a United States of Europe.
Stephen Woolfe, let me go back to Stephen Woolfe from UKIP. Your party leader has talked about Norway, Switzerland. Those are countries which are outside the EU, sovereign, but yet have to follow loads of EU laws and regulations. Both countries' governments admit that. A Norwegian politician famously said, if you want to run Europe, be part of Europe. If you want to be run by Europe, join Norway. So is that the path you're going down?
No, because again, it comes down to a distinction between what you're trying to argue we can't or can't do afterwards. The Norwegians and the Swiss have chosen through the negotiations that they entered into with the European Union to have those choices. What we can do, knowing full well that we are the largest market for the European Union, that Germany's market in here, we are the largest market for Germany, that we would have a huge amount of influence, using Hugo's terms, in the way that we'd enter into the negotiations to choose the way that we want our country to develop and how our relationships to move on. And one of those key factors would be about democracy and would be about power. The EU can have agreements with ourselves, but what it has is a government issuing legislation from unelected commissioners and doesn't have legislation created by us as parliamentarians. I want to bring in Agnes, who's waiting patiently. Very briefly, Hugo, unelected commissioners making laws.
Look, they don't make laws, they propose laws. The people who actually make the laws are the council, which is made up of people like our ministers of finance, people like what Norman Lamont was, and the people like Stephen, the member of parliament.
Agnes, the complaint from British Eurosceptics that the EU is undemocratic, untransparent, unaccountable, that isn't just a British complaint, is it? I mean, Norman Lamont's right. Across the continent, people are feeling distant, they're feeling detached from this Euro elite they don't seem to be able to get rid of.
Of course, we want Europe to be more democrat, and we also want more democracy in our own country. I mean, to go back on sovereignty, I don't know a more sovereign country than Britain. It has opted out from so many EU laws and regulations. It does stand apart from the rest of its colleagues in Europe.
The Schengen Agreement, justice,
exactly,
home affairs,
and
the Euro.
it enjoys a privileged position in Europe. Stay, because it is unique. Britain is the most irritating member, but also the most vocal and incredibly efficient. And it has so much power when it is inside. And many people in Europe are very grateful for Britain's voice. Now, can I just go on European demos? It might, yes, there are different European people, but there's the European spirit. I was educated in 2 countries, and many people here will have studied in different countries in Europe. So there is a spirit which nobody is talking about. Okay, but I think, you know, young people know what I'm talking about.
Lord Lamont, stay, Agnes says. Praise young people, students will applause anything. Agnes says stay, be privileged, be irritating, but stay. We have more opt-outs than any other EU member country. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the basic problem with staying is this, that Europe is going in 2 directions that Britain doesn't want to go. Further political integration and the euro. And does it really make sense to carry on doing that when we do not share the ultimate objective? And that is why I favour getting out. And it's very nice of our French friend to say people are grateful for Britain's awkwardness. But actually, I think the thing that could save Europe and do most to save Europe from the direction which is going is actually to have a vote against British membership, which I think will actually force the European Union to think about real reform. It won't think about it without having a no in the British referendum.
And on that note, Lord Lamont, we're going to have to take a break there. And in part 2 of Head to Head, we're going to be talking to Lord Lamont about what will the role of the UK be on the global stage if it quits the European Union. Join me after the break. Welcome back to Head on Al Jazeera English. On June 23rd, the British public will vote in a referendum to decide whether they want to stay in the European Union or not. But what would life for the British and for the UK government be like across the world as a global player if Britain quits the EU? My guest is Lord Lamont, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, the former Finance Minister of the UK. Lord Lamont, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, Philip Hammond, member of your Conservative Party, you know him well, has pointed out that none of our allies wants us to leave the EU. Not Australia, not New Zealand, not Canada, not the US. In fact, the only country, if the truth is told, that would like us to leave the EU is Russia. That should probably tell us all we need to know. Does that tell you, Lord Lamont, all you need to know?
Well, I think the accusation that Russia wants us to leave the EU should be treated with a large pinch of salt. I've had a few ambassadors saying this to me, and they say, oh boy, you haven't seen the telegrams. I know what Mr. Putin is thinking in the Kremlin. This is, I'm afraid, just propaganda. But, you know, obviously, if you take the United States government, I'm sure thinks it doesn't want Britain to leave the EU. Now, why would that be? We are their voice in Europe. Well, I can understand that they take that view. But ultimately, this is something that has to be decided on the basis of what is good for Britain, what is good for Britain economically, and what is good for Britain politically. And the main point I've been trying to make in this discussion has been actually, our democracy is being eroded. We are creating a monster in Europe that's not answerable to public opinion, which will, in the end in disaster, just as the euro will end in disaster too, eventually.
So you accept that we're alone on this internationally?
Questions of identity and by whom you wish to be governed can only be decided by the people of a country. No one else is entitled
Agreed.
to...
I don't think anyone's questioning that.
Well, but
to make that decision, the British public want to know, well, hold on, will we be isolated in the world? Will we lose power and influence in Washington, D.C.? And does it not bother you even a little bit that you have, on one side of the argument, the White House, the EU, the Commonwealth allies, and on the other side of the argument, you have Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, and yes, Vladimir Putin maybe as well. I mean, that seems to be the international breakdown from where I'm sitting. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think the inclusion of Le Pen was not worthy of you, Mehdi.
But Marine Le Pen is a supporter of Brexit. Right, she said it will be like the Berlin Wall coming down.
That just... let's examine the argument, not who supports it.
Well, OK, well, let's go back to the argument is this, that on the international stage, let's take Putin then. Let's put Marine Le Pen to one side. Putin, the Russians, do benefit from the breakup of the EU that you want to see, that would be started by Brexit potentially, because it's the EU that's putting sanctions on Russia. It's the EU that's trying to present a common front on all these issues involving...
I don't believe that Russia would gain or be affected by the breakup of the EU. I do not believe that Mr. Putin regards the EU as a geopolitical player, and he's quite right not to. The EU is good at trade. The EU is good at some issues of regulation. That's what it's meant to be about. The EU is overreaching itself when it attempts to be a power. Let's take foreign policy questions.
The Iran nuclear deal.
On the Iraq war, they couldn't decide which side they're on. Take the Falklands War. They couldn't decide. Different countries had different views. Take the recognition of Kosovo. Different countries have different views. On almost every foreign policy question, there is a split within the EU.
Not on the Iranian nuclear deal. The biggest geopolitical deal of 2015 would not have happened without the EU. Do you accept that?
But I do accept that Europe was, for once, united on the Iranian nuclear deal. But on the vast majority of foreign policy questions, Europe is deeply divided. The EU is not a diplomatic player in military matters or in foreign policy.
Well, you say military matters. In terms of national security, let's forget for a moment the open letter from 13 of Britain's most senior former military commanders saying it's in the UK's national security interest to remain an EU member because of Russia, because of ISIL. They're retired. But look at the current head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who says for NATO, it is important to have a strong Europe and a strong Britain in a strong Europe. The current US government says it's in the UK's national security interest to be part of the EU. The current head of Europol, the EU law enforcement agency, who's British, Rob Wainwright, says leaving the EU would, quote, make the UK's job harder to protect citizens from terror.
I don't believe, and I can't see any reason, you didn't give any reason, why Britain leaving the EU should affect our membership of NATO or the effectiveness of NATO in any way. You know, Britain commits a certain amount of resources, a lot of resources, compared to other countries to NATO. So I don't see, you know, Norway is out and Norway is a good contributor to NATO. What's the issue? I don't see it. But if you're talking
That's
about...
what NATO is saying. I'm just telling you what NATO is saying.
All your questions have been blah, blah, blah says. You know, let's actually examine the arguments.
Yeah.
Don't just be confused by...
I just wish I'd quoted Jacques Delors.
Well, you know, Mehdi, well... For an iconoclastic journalist who I much admire, you're surprisingly subservient to important names.
And yours.
But on the issue of internal security, that is a completely different set of issues. You quoted the head of Interpol. As you know, a previous head of Interpol, Mr. Noble, actually described the Schengen area as a sort of free trade area for terrorists.
Which we're not part of, the Schengen area.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that the Schengen area doesn't affect our security if a lot of terrorists are allowed to get into it.
But we're not part of the Schengen area. Let me ask you one last question before we go back to our panel. In October 2012, the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize because, according to the judges, quote, for over 6 decades it contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights in Europe. Less than 4 years later, rather than feeling proud about being part of that achievement, that organisation, you want the British public to turn their backs on that organisation that helped secure that peace in Europe after World War II.
I don't regard the European Union as being the institution which has achieved peace in Europe. I think that is primarily NATO. I think the world has changed. You know, the idea, thank God, that there might be a war between France and Germany, I think is not a real possibility.
Okay, well, let's go back to our panel on that. Hugo DIXON is the author of The In-Out Question, Why Britain Should Stay in the EU and Fight to Make It Better, editor-in-chief of InFacts, a website making the case for British membership of the EU. Hugo, the EU shouldn't get credit for securing peace in Europe. It was NATO, and we'll still have NATO even after Britain pulls out of the European Union.
NATO has played the bigger role, but the EU has done very important things. For example, after the breakup of the Soviet Empire, bringing those Eastern European countries into the EU was a hugely valuable thing. NATO is important, very important, but we have a presidential frontrunner in America at the moment, Donald Trump, who is saying that if he becomes president, he would like to downgrade American involvement in NATO. Even if he doesn't become president, and I damn well hope he doesn't become president, America is tiring of the role of playing the global policeman. In Europe, we live in a dangerous part of the world. North Africa and the Middle East are blowing up. Putin, which you mentioned, he's flexing his muscles in the East. We are going to be stronger and safer if we stay together with our European allies than if we splinter away. And as Norman Lamont wants, he wants that actually to trigger the dissolution of the entire EU, which will be even more destabilising.
Stephen Woolfe is a member of the European Parliament for the UK Independence Party, which campaigns against British membership of the EU. There are people who are worried and say, look at the EU breakup that may happen after Brexit is being cheered on by Geert Wilders, Marine Le Pen in France, other such far right-wing parties who favour their countries pulling out of the EU.
Well, I would say she's far left,
some criticise your party as a right-wing, far right-wing party. What do you say to that argument, that it's going to stoke up those nationalist sentiments?
Well, the thing that's stoking up national influence is actually two things. First of all is the elites in this European Union that have been ignoring the impact of bringing in power into the centre and not being enabling those people across Europe to have their voices heard. And the second aspect is, of course, the monumental mistake that Merkel made in allowing mass migration to impact into the European Union. And again, that's stoking up those people who are using immigration in a nasty way, which I believe if we leave the European Union, we can have an outwardly trading, open-looking immigration policy that treats the whole world equally, rather than just saying Europe good, rest of the world bad.
Okay, Agnès POIRIER is a French journalist and author in London. Do you want to respond to what you heard from Stephen there?
Well, on peace, I mean, our memory is so short. we've enjoyed 70 years of peace. You know, to say now, because we just take it for granted that France and Germany would never be at war again, well, thank you, Europe. And now, in terms of terror, you know, something was very striking after the Brussels attack. 30 minutes later, you could hear partisans of the Leave camp saying, oh, well, that's really evidence that we should leave because all these jihadists have European passports, so let's close the doors and we'll be so much safer. Well, 10 years ago, when London was attacked, did I hear anyone in Europe say, oh, they were brought up in Yorkshire, they have UK passports, we should eject Britain so that we're not invaded by homegrown British jihadists? No, I didn't hear any of this. What I heard was solidarity for a terrible thing.
Lord Lamont, do you want to respond?
Hugo rightly said the US is tiring of Europe not making the resources available to defend itself. That is perfectly true. But that needs every country in Europe to spend more on defense. Britain is one of the very few countries that honors its NATO commitment, spending 2%. It's up to the individual countries. They need to do that. Europe itself, you know, it pretends to have some military presence, some military organization, but it's largely just a lot of scrambled egg on generals' shoulders.
Okay. Let's go to our audience here in the Oxford Union who've been waiting patiently. Let's take a question from the back. Let's take the lady in the front row.
I'd like to ask a question about the impact of Brexit on the Union and what consideration you would give to the possibility of English votes determining to leave and Scottish votes, and particularly the impact of on the Scottish Parliament and what their attitude might be.
Well, obviously that's a very important issue. It's one that matters to me a lot. I am Scottish, obviously as a Conservative, a unionist, but I don't think one can let the issue of Scottish independence determine this once in a 45-year timescale issue for the whole of the UK. Consider where Scotland would be if it decided to hold a referendum if Britain had voted to leave the EU. Scotland would then end up being outside the UK and also outside the EU, because Scotland would be outside the EU.
But the polls do show that the Scots are more likely, a majority of Scots say they would vote yes if Brexit happened against their will. There is a link in Scottish voters' minds.
Well, the polls were wrong before, and I think they would be wrong again.
OK, let's go back to the audience. Let's go to the gentleman here in the second row.
I want to know why it's acceptable for a Tory peer to make an open appeal to nationalism and identity for a reason to vote in a European referendum, whereas members of Yes campaigns in Scotland were openly compared to early 20th century fascists without even suggesting that nationalism was relevant, just for wanting to make arguments about democracy, whereas you openly say identity is a core reason, and that's valid. Like, what's the difference?
No, there isn't a difference. No. Look, I don't dispute for 1 second, although, you know, I think there is an identity called British, which I happen to identify with as much as I identify with being Scottish. I don't wish to give that up. There are, you know, people can have several identities, but I don't for 1 minute dispute the right of the Scottish people to have a vote and to define for themselves what their identity is. Of course I accept that.
OK, let's go back to the audience. Gentleman here in the second row also with the glasses and the beard.
Lord Lamont, in a referendum in 2008, voters in Ireland famously rejected the Lisbon Treaty, but EU leaders weren't willing to take no for an answer. They pressured Ireland into holding a second referendum and eventually got the answer they wanted. Do you not fear that if Britain votes on the 23rd of June to leave the EU, that the same might happen to us?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. And when Mehdi was interviewing Vivian Redding.
Well, that was a close watch you did of that
he
show.
Quoted, he quoted to her what Jean-Claude Juncker, the Luxembourg head of the Commission, said on a previous referendum. He said, if it's a yes, we will say on we go, and if it's a no, we will say we continue. So this is deeply embedded in the psychology of the EU. Giscard d'Estaing, the former president of France, put it even more explicitly once, talking about the European Constitution. He said, public opinion will be led to adopt, without knowing it, the proposals that we dare not present to them directly. And Raymond Barre, a former Prime Minister of France, had said, I have never understood why public opinion about European ideas should be taken into account at all. This is deeply embedded. There is a belief we know best, a supranational Europe is best, all national votes are against building our pet project Europe, and we are going to ignore them.
Okay. Let's go back to the audience. Can I just point out, for a man who doesn't like quotes, he brought along a stack of quotes that he has in his pocket. Nicely done, Lord Lamont. Can we go to the lady here in the second row, and then I want to go to the back.
Hi, I would like to ask, as a Bulgarian student in the EU, what's going to happen with me if the UK leaves the EU? Am I going to become an illegal immigrant? And what's going to happen with all the other EU citizens in the UK?
No, of course, people. I don't think we would have with the EU even a visa requirement. I think we will obviously have border controls, but I think we will still have a large degree of immigration from Europe. What we need is a better balance within our immigration system, but we won't be imposing visas. When I say we, I won't have the slightest say in it. I'm speculating about what a government...
But just a moment ago you were telling us that, aren't you worried about all these terrorists that are infiltrating Europe? And now you're saying I'm fine with lots of immigration from Europe, no visas. It seems to be you want to have your cake and eat it.
Well, it is possible to have checks.
Which we have now.
No, wait a minute, Mehdi, wait a minute. The checks that are made at borders, even under a passport system, have to be within the law of the country and have to accord with certain criteria. And the European Court of Justice has actually been at odds with the British government over the sorts of checks it applies when it examines people's passports. That's where the issue of security and terrorism comes in.
Okay. But we have turned away 6,000 European nationals, I believe, since 2010. I'm going to take this lady here who's been waiting.
I was wondering what you would say to British people who think that EU actually represents them better than their current government by providing social protection, for instance, through working hour regulation, by providing a brighter future, perhaps through green policies, and thinking that perhaps EU is more serious about tackling tax evasion as the current government seems to be.
I would answer that by saying that when you talk about welfare rights or social rights, they don't come from Europe. They may be embodied in European law, but actually, they are things that can be established by national governments. They have been established by national governments. But, I don't think these things should be irreversible. These things should be there to be the subject of elections and the subject of argument.
I said we'll go to this gentleman here.
There's an increasing trade protectionism rising in the US. And what do you think that's going to mean if Britain leaves the EU, in the sense that many US workers, average Americans, don't really care about having a lot of imports come from the UK? So
I totally agree with you. The rise of protectionism in the US it's not just the rise of protectionism. I think almost everything about this US election is highly alarming, and the rhetoric of the things Donald Trump and indeed the things Senator Cruz says I find extremely unpalatable. There is a lot of protectionism in the United States, and the average, I remember once arguing about steel tariffs with US congressmen, and they just said, it's our constituents, end of argument. So
aren't we safer from that, being part of a club of 500 million people, rather than going to the US on our own saying, please, sir, can we do a deal with you?
You say that, but Europe at the moment doesn't have a trade agreement with the United States. Trade is determined by willing customers and willing sellers. And
who also have to operate in a world of tariffs and non-tariff barriers.
Do you know what the average tariff of the EU is?
No, you tell me.
3%.
Okay, so you're happy to pay that?
Well, you know, 3% is not going to be a huge
On
deterrence
cars, I believe
to
it's
trade.
10%.
We are the biggest purchaser of German cars there is. Do you really think Germany is going to allow the EU to impose a 10% tariff on us? Come on, Mehdi, you know better than that.
And you know that it has to be unanimous agreement of 27 countries, and one small country...
Okay, so Bulgaria is going to block BMW?
Well, recently we saw the Dutch block a deal with the Ukrainians. Any small country could do anything.
Well, I do believe, as I've already said, that the EU needs a trade agreement with Britain just as much as Britain needs a trade agreement.
Come on. Well, really? You really believe that? I mean, they send 7% of their exports to us. We send 45% of ours to them. Our exports to the EU represent 13% of our GDPs. Theirs represents 3% of their GDP. We're not equals, Lord Lamont.
This argument about percentages.
Oh, numbers, facts, pesky.
The larger the unit, the smaller the percentage. Come off it. Generally, trade is for mutual advantage. It's not a form of warfare.
Agreed, agreed. Let's go to the back. Let's go to that lady there in the third row with her hand up.
Lord Lamont, would you not accept that the best answer is to remain in a reformed Europe which embodies the principle of subsidiarity, where issues are dealt with at the most appropriate level, such as climate change, which is not a national issue?
No, I do agree with that. I think it would have been best if we had had a reformed Europe. But I do believe that if Britain votes to come out, I think that will have the effect of forcing the European Union actually to think about what it is doing, and we might actually get some new proposals coming out of Europe on that.
Okay, let's take one final question for the gentleman at the back there.
What kind of message does it send to the international community when Britain effectively turns its back on the EU that's trying its best to allocate refugees across the EU as widely and as fairly as possible? What kind of message does that send if Britain were to leave the EU?
Well, I don't for 1 minute think we should turn our back on refugees. There is an appalling humanitarian crisis, but I don't think the European Union has been at all effective in dealing with this situation. And I believe you've got a basic contradiction that, on the one hand, Mrs. Merkel wants to admit 1 million people into Germany, but at the same time, they want to preserve Schengen and have national quotas. Well, you can't have national quotas and the Schengen system as well. The refugees will obviously just move around. But I think what needs to be done is, one, we need a proper policy for refugees. I think we probably should admit more into this country. I do think that. But actually, I think you probably could have achieved just as much by governments, sovereign governments, talking to each other as has been done already.
Lord Lamont, one last question before we finish. If the UK votes to stay in the EU on June 23rd, will you and other Brexiteers, as you're known now, accept the result and give up on the Brexit pipe dream, maybe retire to the south of France and stop banging on about Europe, as David Cameron once said? Will it all be over?
Well, I've not been banging on about Europe. I supported our membership when we first joined. I supported it in the referendum. I've never advocated it until this minute, but I have been persuaded because I do believe the euro is a latent disaster. It's not over, the crisis in the euro, and that is the focus of the EU, and that is going to be a mess that is going to drag us down.
And will the
referendum
referendum
therefore, I think I will accept the result.
There won't be calls for another referendum a few years down the line. We had one after 40-odd years.
Well, I don't imagine there'll be one for quite a while.
So this will settle it for a generation?
Well, we'll have to see.
Okay. Lord Lamont, thanks for joining me on Head to Head. Thank you to our panel here in the Oxford Union. Thanks to our audience here in the Oxford Union. Head to Head will be back next week.